there is a strait that divides two continents and yet unites thousands of years of history. A narrow waterway where East and West have collided, crumbled, and reshaped the world. It was on these shores that the War of Troy raged. Through this passage, the Persians launched their fleets toward the heart of Greece. Rome's legions guarded its crossings. Byzantium and Islam clashed at its gates. Napoleon dreamed of conquering it. And in 1915, on the blood-soaked beaches of Gallipoli, hundreds of thousands fell for its control. This was 3 years before the Battle of Megiddo, fought near the very location Revelation names as Armageddon, the site of the final and most terrible battle in human history. That battle opened the path to the rebirth of the State of Israel in 1948 and to the beginning of the modern Middle East conflict. This is not just a geographic border, it is the fulcrum of empires. A hidden axis whose control has meant power and whose loss has meant collapse. But what if this is not a coincidence? What if an ancient prophecy, written centuries before Christ and millennia before the First World War, foretold that the fate of nations would be decided at this very place? This is not merely a story from our ancient past. It is not just a tale from the Middle Ages, nor is it a narrative of the modern era alone. This is a prophetic chronicle that transcends time itself, a revelation of heavenly powers that rule over nations, unseen spirits who wage war not only for borders and thrones, but for the very souls of men. Their battles have shaped the script of our history, yet never strayed from the author's design, the sovereign ruler of the universe who, as the book of Daniel declares, raises up kings and casts them down. Before him, empires collapse like clay when their days are numbered, and found wanting on the scales of heaven. Join us on a journey unlike any other, a journey where history unfolds like a book whose final chapter has not yet been opened.
Iran launching a massive aerial attack on Israel. This, the moment an Iranian missile struck Tel Aviv. 7 people were injured in that strike. The Israeli military saying that their entire nation is now under fire.
More is on the way. The regime doesn't know what hit them. They don't know what will hit them. The nation of Iran and the nation of Israel have been true friends since the days of Cyrus the Great. And the time has come for you to unite around your flag and your historic legacy by standing up for your freedom from an evil and oppressive regime.
To many, this is just another chapter in the endless tensions of the Middle East. But what if the roots of this conflict reach far deeper, not decades, but millennia into the past? Long before the Islamic Republic of Iran, there was another name for this land, a name spoken across empires: Persia. And the relationship between Persia and the Jewish people was not always marked by enmity. It was a Persian king, Cyrus the Great, who ended the Babylonian captivity and allowed the exiles of Israel to return and rebuild their temple. For this, the prophet Isaiah would call him the Lord's anointed. Yet Persia would not remain unchanged. The Parthians rose, then the Sassanid Empire, proud, powerful, and destined to clash with the Christian Byzantine world. And then came the fire that changed everything, the rise of Islam. A new force swept across the lands once ruled by Cyrus. But was all of this foretold? Did a prophecy written in exile, a vision given to a man in Babylon, foresee not just the kings of Persia, but the rise of Islam, the fall of empires, and the return of Israel in our own time? What if the war between Persia and Israel is not just politics, but the unfolding of a divine script? every empire, every war, every rising and falling crown. They are not isolated events, but pages in a divine manuscript, a story still in motion. And as we turn its pages, we begin to see the patterns, the shadows, the echoes of an ancient vision given to a man named Daniel, a vision that may soon find its ultimate fulfillment. It was April 23rd, 536 BC. Along the banks of the great Tigris River, in what is now modern-day Iraq, an aged man stood alone. Ed was weary from years of exile. His hair had turned gray, his strength diminished, but his mind remained sharp and his spirit still unshaken. The man was Daniel, once a young captive in Babylon, now a prophet and statesman at the twilight of his days. It had been nearly 3 years since a momentous shift in world history. Cyrus the Great of Persia had conquered the Babylonian Empire and issued a decree that would change Jewish history forever. The exiles could return home. Decades earlier, the prophet Jeremiah had foretold this moment, that the captivity would last 70 years, and then Babylon would fall. That prophecy had now been fulfilled. And yet, as Daniel stood by the river, another vision was about to be revealed, one unlike any he had ever received before. God was not seeking power, he was seeking understanding. And what he received was a revelation that would span the fate of empires, the rise of kings, and the battles between heaven and earth. It was a vision not just for his time, but for ours. Generation after generation has wrestled with this vision, seeking to grasp its sweeping historical arc, and yet so often falling short. The early church fathers pondered its symbols. The reformers traced its patterns through papal Rome. Even Isaac Newton, father of modern science, dedicated decades of his life to its unraveling. In the 20th century, Christian Zionists saw in it the rebirth of Israel, and countless scholars, pastors, and visionaries have sought to break the seals that Daniel was told to close until the time of the end. But now, for the first time in history, with the full panorama of human events behind us and the convergence of prophecy before us, this vision may finally unfold in all its brilliance. And when its mystery is unveiled, so too will be revealed the identity of the one Scripture calls the man of lawlessness, the beast 666, or the Antichrist. In the 10th chapter of the book of Daniel, we learn that this vision came after a time of mourning and fasting, and it began not with a king, but with an angel. A radiant being appeared to Daniel, his voice like the roar of a multitude. He spoke of cosmic conflict, of spiritual princes over Persia and Greece, and of a war that raged beyond the eyes of men. But as many biblical scholars have come to believe, this glorious figure was no ordinary angel. He was someone far greater. The description Daniel gives, clothed in linen, with a belt of gold, eyes like blazing fire, face shining like lightning, and a voice like the sound of many waters, is not only awe-inspiring, it is unmistakable. These are the very same attributes revealed to the Apostle John centuries later on the island of Patmos, when he saw Jesus Christ standing among 7 golden lampstands, in a vision that opened the book of Revelation. This was the eternal Word, the Son of God, the Alpha and Omega, appearing in pre-incarnate glory to unveil the fate of nations, and to assure his servant Daniel that though kings may rise and fall, the throne of heaven remains unmoved. But even the eternal heavenly throne once trembled at the moment when the King of Kings bore the weight of all the kingdoms of earth. And in that moment, as foretold by King David in the Psalms, the Redeemer of Israel cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? I am a worm and not a person,
a disgrace of mankind and despised by the people. All who see me deride me. They sneer, they shake their heads, saying, "Turn him over to the Lord. Let him save him. Let him rescue him." For dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. They look, they stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and they cast lots for my clothing.
Hey Rachel, have you ever heard of a Finnish prophecy author named Samuel Tuominen?
No, I don't think so. Should I?
Well, I just finished reading his book, To Whom the Majesty of Kingship Has Not Been Conferred, The Antichrist Revealed. And I have to say, the last chapter is quite fascinating. It's one of the most fascinating interpretations of Daniel chapter 11 I've ever come across.
Really? That chapter's usually either ignored or explained away as ancient history.
Exactly. But Tuominen doesn't just stick with the old Seleucid narrative. He actually traces the prophecy across millennia, from ancient Persia and the Byzantine Empire to the rise of Islam, the Ottoman period, even up to British imperialism and modern-day Israel.
It's a bold scope, but does he back it up?
Surprisingly well. It's deeply researched, but also prophetic in tone. And here's the thing. His take on verses 10 through 19 blew my mind. He connects them directly to World War I, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Balfour Declaration, and the beginning of the modern Middle East conflict. I haven't seen anyone else draw those connections so clearly.
Sounds like it deserves more attention. Maybe we've been looking at Daniel 11 too narrowly all along.
That's what I'm starting to think. And if he's right, we may be watching prophecy unfold in real time.
Then he said to me, "Do not be afraid, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart on understanding this and on humbling yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to your words. Now I have come to explain to you what will happen to your people in the latter days, because the vision pertains to the days still future."
Oh, hello. I'm Daniel. Yes, that Daniel. The lions, the dreams, the prophecies, it's all true. And if you're wondering about the British accent, well, I did spend some time around the royal court, though not quite the one you're thinking of. Let's just say I've picked up a few things over the centuries. Just popping in for a second, didn't mean to interrupt your video, but I felt I should say I honestly didn't understand half of those visions myself. No, really, not a clue, but I do know this. They weren't about Babylonian cooking recipes or how to train lions. They were about my people, the future of the Jewish nation. The messenger told me that quite clearly, actually. Something about Persia, Greece, the beautiful land. That's Israel, by the way. And yes, Egypt too. But the details? Not my department. I wasn't even supposed to understand them. Just write them down and wait for people like you to figure them out thousands of years later.
And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will stir up the entire empire against the realm of Greece.
Daniel chapter 11 verse 2 begins with a prophecy that seems deceptively simple. 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and then a 4th, far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. At the time Daniel received this vision, in 536 BC, Cyrus the Great was already king of Persia. So the 3 more kings are typically identified as his successors. Cambyses II, Smerdis, also known as Bardaya, and Darius I, known for strengthening the empire. The 4th king, richer and more powerful than the others, is then either Darius I, if Cyrus is counted separately, or more commonly Xerxes I, the king who famously launched a massive invasion against Greece. And this is precisely what the prophecy foretold. He shall stir up everyone against the kingdom of Javan, Javan being the ancient Hebrew word for Greece. Xerxes' invasion marked the height of Persia's westward expansion, but also its turning point. For although Xerxes reached far into Greece, his campaign ultimately failed. And in the long shadow of that failure rose a new power, one foretold in the very next verses of Daniel's vision. Alexander the Great, the mighty king of verse 3, would rise from Greece and crush the Persian Empire, just as Daniel had written nearly 2 centuries earlier. Now here's where things get really fascinating. While most interpreters understand Daniel 11:2 to refer to the ancient Persian kings leading up to Xerxes' invasion of Greece, this same verse appears to foreshadow events that happened more than 1,000 years later. That is, the Great War between Sassanid Persia and the Byzantine Empire in the early 7th century. The final showdown between 2 superpowers just before the rise of Islam. To understand this, we need to follow a simple interpretive key used throughout the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapters 7 and 8, we're told that kings can represent both individual rulers and entire kingdoms. For example, Daniel 7:17 says, "These 4 great beasts are 4 kings." But verse 23 makes it clear they symbolize kingdoms. Likewise, in Daniel 8, the verse 21 says the shaggy goat is the king of Greece, i.e. the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king, meaning its first ruler. Applying that standard here, the 3 more kings of Daniel 11:2 don't have to mean 3 individual rulers. They could just as well refer to 3 successive empires that rose in Persia after the fall of the Achaemenid dynasty. Seeing this way, the 3 are: first, the Seleucid Empire, not ethnically Persian, but it rose from Persia and ruled over it. Second, Parthia. And third, the Sassanid Empire, which in this reading is also the 4th king if we count the Achaemenid Empire as the first. And it's precisely Sasanic Persia that matches the prophecy best. And it just happened to be the last Persian empire, not only it's the most richest one. It rose to unprecedented wealth and power, especially under Khosrau I, who brought Persian civilization to its golden peak. But it was under Khosrau II that Persia, quite literally, stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece, launching a full-scale invasion of the Byzantine Empire. And yes, the Byzantine Empire was also called the Eastern Roman Empire. But throughout the Middle Ages, it was widely known as the Kingdom of the Greeks. In fact, Heraklius, the very emperor who fought back against Khosrau, was the first Byzantine ruler to adopt the title Basileus, the ancient Greek word for king, and he officially changed the empire's language from Latin to Greek, right before Persia's invasion. So whether in the 5th century BC or the 7th century AD, Daniel's vision holds true. Because in prophecy, as in history, some stories are too big to happen just once.
And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, because his sovereignty will be removed and given to others besides them.
What's truly fascinating is that the mighty king in verse 3 doesn't just describe Alexander the Great, but also fits Emperor Heraklius of Byzantium 1,000 years later. And remarkably, both men believed they were fulfilling Daniel's prophecy. The historian Josephus tells us that when Alexander reached Jerusalem, Jewish priests showed him Daniel's vision of a Greek king defeating Persia, and Alexander saw himself in that prophecy. Centuries later, Heraklius saw those same Hebrew prophecies and interpreted them as speaking of him. When he launched a massive campaign against Persia, retook Palestine and Egypt, and entered Jerusalem as a divinely chosen deliverer to kings, to empires, one vision stretching across the ages.
The war between Byzantium and Sassanid Persia in the early 7th century was no ordinary conflict. It was the next great upheaval in the land of Israel, the most devastating since the crucifixion of Christ and the destruction of the Second Temple, and it did not go unnoticed by history. For the first time, all three great monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and soon Islam, stood at the brink of a world about to change forever. It was the final storm before the desert winds rose, and Islam burst forth like wildfire, sweeping through Jerusalem, Syria, Egypt, and beyond, shaking the ancient world to its foundations. When Khosrow II took Jerusalem, he granted the Jews permission to return and even encouraged them to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem. It was as if he saw himself as a new Cyrus, a redeemer of Israel. But that hope was short-lived. Khosrow betrayed the Jews and joined forces with the Emperor Heraklius, a man no less hostile to the people of the covenant, and so once again the chosen people were caught between the crushing weight of empires. Centuries earlier, the one who appeared to Daniel, the coming king and the redeemer of the Jews, had said, "Now I return to fight against the prince of Persia. And when I have gone forth, behold, the prince of Greece will come, but I will show you what is written in the book of truth. And none stands with me against them, except Michael, your prince."
At its core, Daniel chapter 11 tells a story of ongoing conflict. A centuries-long struggle in which the Holy Land, and especially Jerusalem, stands at the very center. A battleground between East and West, North and South, played out not just between kings, but between entire civilizations. In this prophetic vision, the Dardanelles and Bosporus Straits form the dividing line, the watershed between the continents of Asia and Europe. It was across these very straits that Xerxes I of Persia launched his invasion of Europe, and over 1,000 years later, Khosrow II did the same. But Europe struck back, first through Alexander the Great, and later through Heraklius, Emperor of Byzantium. These invasions laid the foundations for the Western world as we know it, a civilization that still draws its identity from Athens and Jerusalem, from Greek philosophy and Judeo-Christian values. The old Zoroastrian Persian Empire fell, but in its place rose the Islamic world. And so the East-West conflict continued, now between the cross and the crescent. Some historians even view Heraklius as a kind of proto-crusader, the first Christian emperor to reclaim Jerusalem, bringing with him what medieval Europe would revere as its most sacred relic, the true cross of Christ, recovered from the Persians.
Ah yes, the true cross. According to Christian tradition, it was the actual wooden cross upon which Jesus was crucified. The story goes that it was discovered in the 4th century by Helena, the mother of Emperor Constantine, during her pilgrimage to Jerusalem. From that point on, the true cross became one of the most venerated relics in Christendom. Not just as a symbol of faith, but as a kind of divine guarantee, a physical connection to the moment of redemption itself. In the medieval imagination, possession of the true cross was almost like having God's personal endorsement of your empire. So when Heraklius reclaimed it from the Persians and brought it back to Jerusalem in the 630s, well, that was seen not just as a military victory, but as a cosmic restoration of divine order. To put it in modern terms, it wasn't just a religious artifact. It was the crown jewel of medieval geopolitics.
Whether or not we believe in the miraculous powers of medieval relics, there's something undeniably fascinating about the story of the true cross, because in many ways it connects the events of the 630 SAD to a moment nearly 6 centuries earlier, to the very heart of Christian history. The book of Daniel, chapter 9, foretold with stunning precision the exact timing of Jesus Christ's death, right down to the very week in April of 33 AD. And if the story is true, that Helena, the mother of Constantine the Great, discovered the original cross on which our Lord was crucified under Emperor Tiberius. Then Heraklius wasn't just a Christian emperor. He was, quite literally, the first crusader in history. The wooden cross, once a symbol of shame and death, a tool of Roman slavery and execution, had now become a banner of divine kingship. And the Jewish rabbi once nailed to it was now held as a king before whom even Roman emperors bowed. A king whose cross inspired them to march into battle, to reclaim the holy city from the hands of unbelievers.
Had Heraclius not triumphed? Had he not shattered the armies of Khosrow II and saved Constantinople from collapse? The world as we know it would not exist, for in those dark days of the early 7th century, the emperor in Constantinople stood as the last wall of Christendom. The Bishop of Rome was powerless. The Western Church lay battered by barbarian invasions. There was no Holy Roman Empire, no Charlemagne, no Crusades. Only the Eastern Empire remained, bloodied but unbroken. And so it was not by steel alone, but by the will of the crucified King of Kings, that Heraclius held the line, not by his own strength, but by the one who once bore a cross, and now, unseen, strengthened the walls of New Rome. But though Constantinople's walls stood, and the cross was raised once more in Jerusalem, the victory of Heraclius would not last. For even as he returned in triumph, a new storm was already gathering on the southern horizon, a fire that would sweep across the deserts of Arabia and consume the lands he had just reclaimed. Within a few short years, Islam arose, and Heraclius would lose Egypt, Syria, and even the Holy Land to a new empire, born not of Persia, but of the sword and the crescent. He saved the walls of New Rome, but lost the heart of the Holy Land, and perhaps this too was judgment. For the emperor who worshipped the King of the Jews had turned against the people of the king. After his alliance with the Jews during the Persian War, Heraclius broke his word and joined in their persecution, and so the Lord of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the same God who had spared his empire from Khosrow's fury, now withdrew his hand. For had he not declared from the very beginning, "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, and in you all the nations of the earth shall be blessed."
Now that we understand how the term king in the book of Daniel can refer not only to individual rulers, but also to entire empires, this opens the door for a long-range historical interpretation of verses 4 through 20. The very verses that precede the rise of the Antichrist figure in verse 21, who brings persecution upon the Jewish people. In the original fulfillment, these verses were traditionally understood to predict, with astonishing accuracy, the post-Alexandrian world, how Alexander the Great's empire was divided into 4 successor kingdoms, and how 2 of them, the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, the king of the south, and the Seleucid dynasty in Syria, the king of the north, engaged in decades of conflict. That conflict culminated in the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes, who became king of the Seleucid Empire in 175 BC. He desecrated the Jewish temple and persecuted the people of Israel, just as prophesied in verses 31 to 45. Daniel chapter 8 had already symbolized these events in the vision of the ram and the goat, but chapter 11 expands on them, adding layer upon layer of precise historical detail. But since the histories of kingdoms are measured not in decades but in centuries, the rise of the king of the south, described in verse 5, must cover a long stretch of history following the Byzantine-Assanid War in the early 7th century. Daniel received this vision while staying near the Tigris River in what is now modern-day Iraq. At the time, this region, ancient Babylonia, was also the heart of the Jewish diaspora under Gentile rule, a cultural and spiritual center for Jews in exile all the way until the Crusades. If you look at a map, you'll see that the Arabian Peninsula lies directly to the south of Iraq, and it was from this land, from the descendants of the biblical Ishmaelite, that one of the greatest empires and civilizations in human history arose in the aftermath of that war. This civilization, Islam, has stood in tension and conflict with the Western Judeo-Christian world ever since. In this light, Daniel's prophecy continues with astonishing accuracy, as if the next page of the history book had been written after the war between Heraklius and Khosrow II, in accordance with Daniel's vision.
Then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, that is, the king of the north, who will gain ascendancy over him and rule. His domain will be a great realm indeed.
Now, identifying the king of the north becomes a bit more complicated. If we apply a surface-level reading of the prophecy, we might conclude that the king of the north refers to the Ottoman Empire, as even Isaac Newton did in the early 18th century when Ottoman power was at its peak, or perhaps to the Russian Empire, which rose to global prominence when the Ottomans were already in decline. After all, both of these empires were located to the north of Israel, or Mesopotamia. But there's a problem. In verse 8, the king of the north is said to attack Egypt, and in verse 16, he is described as occupying the beautiful land, that is, the land of Israel. This rules out Russia as a candidate, because Russia never conquered Palestine nor waged war against Egypt. The Ottoman Sultanate, on the other hand, did conquer both Egypt and Palestine, but it still doesn't fully match the prophecy because, according to verse 5, the king of the north is to become mightier than the king of the south. And historically, the Ottoman Empire never grew larger or more powerful than the Arab caliphates that preceded it, especially not the vast Umayyad or Abbasid caliphates. Furthermore, one could argue that the Ottoman Sultanate was not a separate king of the north at all, but rather the final expression of the king of the south. After all, it was the successor and culmination of Islamic Arab power, the last great caliphate, whose rulers saw themselves as heirs of the Prophet Muhammad.
So, who or what is this mysterious king of the north? If even the mighty Ottoman Empire, feared by all of Europe, was not the king of the north, but rather a continuation of the southern Islamic dominion, then the northern kingdom must rise after the height of Ottoman power in the 18th or 19th century, and it must do what the prophecy says: go to war against Egypt and occupy the beautiful land, the land of Israel. Only one empire fits this precise description: the British Empire. Rising to global supremacy in the mid-1700s, the Royal Navy clashed with Egypt during the Napoleonic Wars and again later, and during the First World War it captured and ruled over Palestine. But wait, how could Britain be the king of the north when, from the vantage point of ancient Israel or Babylon, Britain lies far off in the northwest? Surely, shouldn't it be called the king of the northwest then?
While many interpret the kings of the south and north from the vantage point of the land of Israel, we must remember, in the Middle Ages and early modern period, there was no Jewish state. The Jewish people were scattered across the nations, living in exile. At the time of the Byzantine-Sassanid War, Mesopotamia may have served as a logical geographical reference point, but by the era of the Crusades, the once flourishing Jewish community in Babylon had largely vanished under Islamic rule. To truly understand the compass of this vision, we must revisit the historical context of verses 4 and 5. Verse 4 states, "And when he has arisen, His kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not to his descendants, nor according to the dominion he ruled. This prophecy connects two pivotal moments in history, the Arab conquests in the 630s and the events of the Crusader era in the High Middle Ages. The breaking up of Heraklius' kingdom refers first to the rapid Islamic expansion at the end of his reign. His core territories in Asia Minor were reorganized into four military provinces, ruled not by his descendants but by generals known as stratoi. Then, nearly 6 centuries later, the prophecy speaks again, through the Fourth Crusade. In 1204, Western Crusaders turned against their Eastern Christian brothers, overthrew the Byzantine emperor, and established the Latin Empire in Constantinople. This final fall of the empire fits the closing words of the verse. His kingdom shall be uprooted and given to others, not to his descendants. These others, in this context, were Western, primarily Roman Catholic powers from medieval France and beyond, nations that came to rule both Jerusalem and Constantinople during the 12th and 13th centuries. The events of the Crusader era must be placed within the context of verse 4, as they represent the next major upheaval in the history of the Holy Land and Asia Minor, following the Arab conquests of the 630s. We already know from the historical setting of the vision that its narrative is centered on this region. These events were later followed by the rise of the Ottoman Caliphate, which emerged from within Asia Minor and, by the early 16th century, controlled the entire former territory of the Eastern Roman Empire. The final fall of Constantinople in 1453 stands as one of the most significant turning points in world history, and it can be seen as part of verse 5's description of the rise of the king of the south. For the Ottoman sultans inherited the throne of Heraklius, ruling from the same capital and over the same lands he had governed nearly 1,000 years earlier. So then, since verses 4 to 5 span the rise of Arab power in the 630s all the way to the Ottoman Empire's zenith in the 1680s, verse 6 marks the next great turning point in Middle Eastern history, the Napoleonic Wars. These wars reached deep into the region when Napoleon himself briefly occupied Egypt and Palestine at the close of the 1790s.
France, the very nation that had once led the Crusades beneath the banner of the cross, rallying knights to reclaim the Holy Land in the name of Christ and his true cross, now marched again toward Jerusalem. But this time, it was no longer in the name of the crucified king. It was in the name of reason, of enlightenment, of man enthroned in the place of God. With fire and steel, France sought to liberate the Muslim world, not from tyranny, but from faith itself, from what it saw as the suffocating chains of superstition and zealotry. And it is here, amid the clash of empires and ideologies, that a new power rises from the shadows: Great Britain. To revolutionary France, Britain was the northern force, the immovable bastion of monarchy and divine order. And so, in the unfolding vision of Daniel, Britain now emerges as the king of the north.
So, in verse 6, the compass of Daniel's vision shifts from the sands of the Middle East to the salons and throne rooms of Europe. For by the dawn of the 19th century, it was no longer the caliphates nor Eastern empires that shaped the fate of nations, but the great powers of Europe. And among them, France stood as a towering force, the fountainhead of revolution and culture. Europe had become the pinnacle of civilization, the queen among the nations. And it was now her kings and armies who contended for dominion over the Holy Land.
Revolution-torn and secularized, Europe believed it had cast off the cross of Christ, the very cross for which it had once waged crusades. It declared the death of God, as Nietzsche proclaimed, and buried him beneath the rubble of reason and revolt. And yet, it still hungered for dominion over the very land where we had crucified the Son of God.
It might seem paradoxical to modern sensibilities, but in the 19th century, the great Christian powers of Europe, nations that had largely abandoned the medieval religious fervor of the Crusades, were once again drawn to the Holy Land. But this time, it wasn't salvation they were after, it was strategy. The so-called Eastern Question dominated the geopolitics of the era. As the Ottoman Empire decayed, the major powers scrambled to ensure they'd control the arteries of global trade. Palestine, though barren by modern economic standards, lay at the heart of this contest, not because of oil, which was not yet part of the equation, but because of its position, a bridge between three continents, and more importantly, a gateway to the Suez.
Napoleon saw it first. His Egyptian campaign wasn't merely a military venture, it was a visionary strike aimed at controlling the corridor to India. The British, of course, quickly grasped the implications. Control Egypt and Palestine and you control the back door to the British Raj.
So the Holy Land had become a pawn, not of heaven, but of empire.
Even the mightiest emperor stood powerless beneath the pull of Zion, and the shadow of the cross cast by the crucified and risen king reached them still. As Napoleon confessed on his deathbed, Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and I founded empires, but on what did we rest the creations of our genius? Upon force. Jesus alone founded his empire upon love, and to this very day millions would die for him. I die forgotten, cast away from the stage of life, but Christ? He lives. He asks more than a father asks of a son, more than a bride of her husband, more than a man of his brother. He demands the human heart. And time, the great destroyer, is powerless to extinguish this sacred flame. That, above all, convinces me that he is indeed the Son of God.
Although the nations of Europe were drawn to the Holy Land in the 19th century primarily by economic and strategic interests, rather than by religious devotion or medieval ideals of pilgrimage, God himself, who steers the course of history according to his promises, used these Gentile empires to prepare the way for a far greater return. The return of the Jewish people to their ancestral land. This began in the 1880s with the early waves of Zionist immigration and culminated in the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. But this unfolding began already in the year 1799, when Napoleon Bonaparte conquered Egypt and Palestine, known also as the liberator of the Jews. Having granted full civil rights to Jewish communities long oppressed throughout Europe, Napoleon issued a remarkable proclamation calling Jews from all corners of the world to return to the land of their ancestors and re-establish a Jewish state in Israel. Had Napoleon triumphed over the Allied powers of Europe, the State of Israel might have been reborn already in the early 19th century. But the time was not yet right. God's appointed hour had not come.
And after some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to reach an agreement. But she will not keep her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up, along with those who brought her in and the one who fathered her, as well as he who supported her in those times. But one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and prevail. And he will also take into captivity to Egypt their gods with their cast metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold, and he, on his part, will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years.
Verses 6 to 8 originally describe a short-lived alliance between the southern kingdom of Egypt and the northern kingdom of Syria. In 252 BC, Pharaoh Ptolemy II sought to secure peace by marrying his daughter Berenice to the Seleucid king Antiochus II, Theos. Political marriages were common tools of diplomacy at the time, but this alliance was doomed from the start. After Antiochus abandoned his former wife Laodocus to marry Berenice, Laodocus retaliated by orchestrating the murder of Antiochus, Berenice, and their son. As the prophecy had foretold, the alliance collapsed, and Egypt responded by launching the Third Syrian War, an event reflected in the verses that follow. But in the later fulfillment of this prophecy, the daughter of the king of the south cannot refer to a literal daughter, because the king of the south is not an individual ruler, but a kingdom. As we have already established, in the long-term unfolding of this vision, the king of the south represents the Islamic Empire. both the Arab caliphates of the Middle Ages and their successor, the Ottoman Caliphate. Therefore, if the king of the south refers to the Arab Islamic realm that rose from Arabia, then his daughter must signify its historical offspring, the Ottoman Empire. As a side note, the Bible often uses feminine imagery to describe nations, such as the daughter of Zion or the daughter of Babylon. Even today, nations are commonly personified as women. Consider names like Britannia, Germania, and Hispania, each referring not only to a country, but to a mythologized female figure who embodies the spirit of that nation. Thus, verses 6 to 8 of Daniel chapter 11 describe a political alliance formed between the daughter of the king of the south, the Ottoman Empire, and the king of the north, Great Britain. But this alliance would be short-lived. Soon after, as the prophecy foretells, the two powers would clash militarily in the land of Egypt. As specifically stated in verse 8, the king of the north would fail to conquer Egypt or to defeat the southern power. Instead, the south would emerge victorious from this first confrontation, and the northern king would retreat without achieving his goal.
Like Napoleon's cannons, the prophecy struck with astonishing precision amid the thundering chaos of the early 19th century. In the smoke and fire of empires clashing, the ancient vision unfolded, not in myth but in maps, treaties, and cannon fire. A fragile alliance formed between the Sultan's empire, the daughter of the king of the south, and Britain, the rising king of the north. This alliance was forged out of necessity as the Sultan sought Britain's help to repel Napoleon's advancing forces from Egypt and Palestine, lands whose control was vital to the fate of empires. But as foretold, the pact was short-lived. Soon after, in 1807, British forces set sail toward the sands of Egypt, not as liberators, but as rivals, hoping to secure the vital lifeline to India and keep Napoleon's ambitions at bay. Yet, just as the prophet had seen, the king of the north did not prevail. The British assault of 1807 faltered. Egypt remained unconquered, and the south for now held its ground. Each movement on the chessboard of nations mirrored the ancient script written in the book of Daniel, not merely as metaphor, but as the very scaffolding of history itself.
Britain's alliance with the Ottoman Empire during the Napoleonic Wars was never born out of affection or shared values. It was a cold calculation. With Napoleon threatening Egypt and the Levant, the vital arteries leading to British India, London saw Istanbul not as a friend but as a strategic buffer. For much of the 19th century, Britain posed as the benevolent guardian of the Sultan, shielding him from French and Russian ambitions. But beneath the surface, it was all about preserving Britain's imperial supremacy in the East. The empire could not allow any rival, not even a crumbling Ottoman state, to control the gateway to India. But by the 1830s, the winds of change were already blowing. The successful Greek War of Independence in 1830 reignited European interest in the Eastern Mediterranean, and within a decade, the rise of Christian restorationism, the belief that the Jews should return to their ancestral homeland, began to reshape the political imagination of the age. These ideological tremors laid the groundwork for a new Middle East, one that would not fully emerge until the trenches of the First World War redrew the map of empires.
Then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land.
Verse 9 speaks of the king of the north launching yet another campaign against the territories of the south, only to return to his own land. This appears to correspond with the events of the Greek War of Independence. Not only was it the next time after the Napoleonic Wars that the British Navy found itself in open conflict with the Sultan of Istanbul, now siding with the Greek revolutionaries alongside other European powers, but it also marked a pivotal turning point in history. Remember, the early verses of this vision, from 2 to 4, focused on the Greek kingdom under the Byzantine Empire, the medieval predecessor of the modern Greek nation-state. Now that circle seemed to close, as the Christian people of Greece broke free from centuries of Islamic rule. It was a watershed moment, not just for the Eastern Mediterranean, but for the age of rising national consciousness. Greece's liberation inspired a broader movement of 19th century national romanticism, including the Jewish national revival, Zionism, which many Anglican Christians soon came to support for theological reasons.
Out of the smoke and thunder of Navarino, the last great battle of wooden warships, rose a fiery new spirit of national awakening. A tide of romantic fervor swept through the soul of Europe. The peoples of the continent, long shackled by empires and dynasties, began to remember who they were. Ancient epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, Beowulf, the Kalevala, were no longer mere poetry, but sacred blueprints of forgotten destiny. Myths and history fused into a single burning vision. The same passions that stirred in the hearts of men to revive old hatreds, even anti-Semitism, also ignited a new and unprecedented love for the chosen people. A wave of Christian empathy surged across Europe. Poets, preachers, and princes alike wept at the memory of Israel's exile and called for her restoration, a return to Zion, a rebirth of the homeland in the forsaken wilderness of Palestine. The stage was set, the curtain was drawn. The world now stood at the edge of a new chapter, one written in trenches, fire, and prophecy. The Great War was coming.
Zionism as a movement did not arise from a single ideological source. By the late 19th century, Jewish Zionism had begun to emerge primarily as a secular response to growing anti-Semitism and a deepening sense of national identity, inspired by the romantic nationalism that swept across Europe. But decades earlier, an entirely different kind of Zionism had already taken root in the heart of the British Empire. Christian Zionism, then often called Restorationism, was shaped by theological convictions, especially those found among preachers like John Nelson Darby. They revisited Old Testament prophecies long overlooked by the institutional church, insisting that God had not abandoned Israel and that he would one day bring the Jewish people back to their ancient homeland, not because of their faithfulness, but because of his. For many, this restoration was not only a matter of divine justice, it was a key step in the prophetic timeline, preparing the way for the return of Christ and the establishment of his millennial kingdom on earth. These ideas spread beyond pulpits and pews. By the mid-19th century, they had found a voice in Britain's aristocracy, even reaching the heart of foreign policy through figures like Lord Palmerston. Still, it would be naive to think that all support for a Jewish homeland was entirely altruistic. For Britain, the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine, loyal to London, held immense strategic value. It could serve as a friendly buffer in the east, protecting trade routes and British interests from Cairo to Calcutta.
Therefore say to the house of Israel, I will vindicate the holiness of my great name which has been profaned among the nations, which you have profaned among them. Then the nations will know that I am the Lord, declares the Lord God, when I show myself holy among you in their sight. For I will take you from the nations and gather you from all the lands, and I will bring you into your own land, and you will live in the land that I gave to your forefathers. So you will be my people, and I will be your God. Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 22 to 28. Beloved brethren, we behold in our day the waning of the Turkish dominion, and with it the stirring of ancient promises. The land once given to Abraham lies waiting, and though we know not how nor when, the Lord shall gather his people Israel once more unto their inheritance. He who scattered shall also restore. His word faileth not. Watch and be sober, for the fig tree beginneth to bud.
And his sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, so that he may again wage war up to his fortress. And the king of the south will be enraged and go out and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be handed over to the former. When the multitude is carried away, his heart will be haughty, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. For the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval of some years he will press on with a great army and much equipment.
Verses 10 to 13 describe the final great military campaign in which the king of the south achieves a decisive victory over the king of the north. Just before the beautiful land, that is, Palestine, falls under the control of the northern power. The scale of this battle is significant, as verse 12 specifically states that tens of thousands fall in combat. Some modern Bible translations, such as the NIV and NLT, downplay the number, rendering it as simply thousands. But the New American Standard Bible, considered one of the most accurate English translations, maintains the proper rendering, "He will cause tens of thousands to fall." This detail fits precisely with the events of the First World War's Middle Eastern front. In 1914, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire aligned himself with Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Britain, recognizing the alliance as a threat to its dominance over India, declared war on the Ottoman state. But rather than invading from the south through Egypt, which Britain already controlled, the British Navy attempted a direct assault on the heart of the Ottoman Empire by forcing its way through the Dardanelles Strait, aiming for Istanbul, whence Constantinople, the imperial city of Constantine and Heraklius. This bold maneuver proved disastrous. The British-led assault failed under fierce Turkish resistance. Over 56,000 Allied soldiers were killed, with tens of thousands more wounded or sick. Ottoman losses were nearly as high, but the battle was celebrated as a surprising and morale-boosting victory for the Turks. The failure at Gallipoli became one of the greatest political defeats of Winston Churchill's career, then serving as First Lord of the Admiralty, a blow from which he would not fully recover until the Second World War. Verse 10 says, "His sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, so that he may again wage war up to his fortress." These sons of the King of the North may symbolically refer to the young soldiers of Britain or to her dominions and colonies, since thousands of troops from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and British India joined the Gallipoli campaign. One of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, so that he may again wage war up to his fortress. One of His Majesty King George V's expeditionary forces aimed to push through the Dardanelles, past the defenses of the Sea of Marmara, and reach the Sultan's fortress in Constantinople. Then the King of the South will be enraged and go forth and fight with the King of the North. His heart will be haughty, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. The Sultan of Istanbul, now allied with the German Kaiser, responded in fury. His heart swelled with pride and determination to defend his realm. Though the Turks claimed victory at Gallipoli, inflicting over 56,000 Allied casualties and suffering almost as many themselves, they lacked the strength to achieve a lasting triumph over His Majesty's forces. Then the King of the North will again raise a greater army, and after some years he will advance with a vast force and much equipment. Gallipoli's failure was not the end. It was a prologue. 3 years later came the Sinai and Palestine campaign, launched from Egypt, culminating in the liberation of Jerusalem in 1917 and the collapse of Ottoman rule after 4 centuries.
Now in those times, many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also raise themselves up to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. Then the king of the north will come, pile up an assault ramp, and capture a well-fortified city. And the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land, with destruction in his hand. And he will set his mind on coming with the power of his entire kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace which he will put into effect.
Following the ill-fated Gallipoli campaign, the prophecy continues. Many will rise up against the king of the south, and violent men among your own people will rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but they will fall. This verse corresponds precisely to the events of 1916 to 1918, when many Arabs across the Middle East rose up in armed rebellion against Ottoman rule, fighting alongside the British. The centuries-long dominance of the Ottoman Empire in Arab lands was deeply unpopular, even though the Sultan in Istanbul claimed the title of Caliph, the last great leader of Islam and successor of the Prophet Muhammad. The British, seeking to weaken the Sultan's hold on the region, promised to recognize an independent Arab state after the war, once the Ottomans were overthrown. At the same time, violent men from your own people, that is, from Daniel's people, the Jews, rose up in fulfillment of the vision. This refers to the formation of the Jewish Legion, a small but symbolically significant unit of volunteers who fought under the British flag to liberate Palestine from Ottoman control. Although the broader Zionist movement remained officially neutral during the war, Jews in both the Allied and Central Powers generally siding with their respective homelands, the founders of the Legion, Joseph Trumpeldor and Zeev Jabotinsky, believed that the defeat of the Ottoman Empire was essential to the eventual establishment of a Jewish state. Though the Legion numbered only around 5,000 men and had limited military impact, it marked the birth of a modern Jewish army, foreshadowing the future Israel Defense Forces. Then, in December 1917, under the command of General Edmund Allenby, Britain succeeded in capturing Jerusalem and liberating Palestine, just as verse 16 foretold. Then he will come with the strength of his whole kingdom and will make an agreement with him. This likely refers to the Battle of Megiddo in September 1918, a decisive Allied victory that effectively broke Ottoman power in the region. It was soon followed by the Armistice of Mudros in October, ending hostilities between Britain and the Ottoman Empire, just 11 days before the broader war in Europe came to a close. Fittingly, the Battle of Megiddo took place near the same northern Israeli plain to which the Book of Revelation refers as Armageddon, the site of the final, most cataclysmic conflict in human history.
He will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him or be on his side. Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many. But a commander will put a stop to his taunting against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his taunting. So he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and not be found.
Verses 17 through 19 of Daniel 11 align with astonishing precision to the events that unfolded in the Middle East after World War I between 1919 and 1923. Verse 18 states that the king of the north will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many of them. After the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed VI agreed to the Armistice of Mudros in October 1918, having lost the war alongside Germany, His Majesty's Royal Navy sailed unopposed through the Dardanelles toward Istanbul. In November of that year, under the leadership of British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, the Allies occupied the city and divided the remnants of the Sultan's empire among themselves. For the first time since 1453, the walls of Constantinople had fallen once again. The geographical region referenced in this verse, the coastlands surrounding the Aegean and Marmara Seas, was the same region invaded by Antiochus III during the Hellenistic fulfillment of this prophecy when he attacked Thrace and Greece in the early 2nd century BC. The phrase, the daughter of women, may here refer symbolically to Greece, which in May 1919, with British support, launched an offensive against Smyrna, modern-day Izmir. Lloyd George's government, acting against the will of other Allied leaders, encouraged its Greek ally to further humiliate a defeated Turkey and advance Britain's strategic interests in the region. But when the campaign collapsed, the Greek army mutinied, forcing King Constantine II to abdicate. The monarchy was abolished, and the Second Hellenic Republic was declared, paving the way for a peace agreement with Turkey. As the prophecy says, "She will not stand with him or be on his side." Then a commander will put a stop to his taunting against him. Indeed, he will repay him for his taunting. This was fulfilled by the rise of Turkish general Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, a hero of Gallipoli, who led the Turkish War of Independence against both Greece and Britain. Ataturk's victories forced Britain to abandon its harsh post-war terms and agree to the Treaty of Lausanne in July 1923. This treaty was significantly more favorable to Turkey than the earlier Treaty of Sèvres, drafted at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. Meanwhile, the outbreak of the Irish War of Independence in 1919 weakened Lloyd George's political standing and further constrained Britain's ambitions in the East. Thus, as verse 19 concludes, he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and be seen no more. The Lausanne Treaty marked the end of both the 600-year-old Ottoman Sultanate and the Islamic Caliphate. In its place arose the secular Republic of Turkey, ushering in the birth of the modern Middle East as we know it.
O Constantinople, thou new Rome, city of emperors and seers, whom Constantine the Great, the first Christian Caesar, did establish as the cornerstone of Christendom, and did consecrate unto the everlasting King. City of dreams, where seers beheld visions of glory. City of warriors, from whence the soldiers of Christ departed to wrest the Holy Land from the ungodly. This city of Heraklius, of Suleiman the Magnificent, of the Cross and the Crescent, where civilizations collided in their struggle for dominion over the earth. You were adorned with gold and precious stones like a queen among nations, but you were cast into the sea like that great Babylon. Your fate was carved in stone, foretold from the beginning of time. Constantinople, you stained your hands with the blood of my saints. You barred my people from returning to the land I gave them long before your birth, and so the hour of your judgment came. Thus fell the last imperial throne that once claimed to unite heaven and earth, and from its ashes a new age began.
The collapse of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War marked the beginning of a new era in the Middle East. In the aftermath of the war, the victorious Allied powers redrew the map. France took control of Syria and Lebanon, while Britain assumed mandates over Iraq and Palestine. Although the State of Israel would not be formally established until 1948, the foundations were laid during this time. The Balfour Declaration, British administration, and the gradual return of Jews to their ancestral land set the stage for what was to come. Thus, the fall of the Islamic Caliphate and the dismantling of centuries-old imperial rule gave way to a new political order based on nation-states, a moment many historians consider the birth of the modern Middle East. One of the most consequential outcomes of World War I was the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which Britain expressed support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. At the same time, Britain had made promises to Arab leaders about supporting independence in former Ottoman territories. After the war, several Arab states did emerge, like Iraq, Transjordan, and later Saudi Arabia, but many Arabs felt the European mandates fell short of true self-determination. Meanwhile, tensions grew in Palestine, where Jewish immigration increased under British rule. Through a series of overlapping and ambiguously worded commitments, such as the Balfour Declaration and the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence, Britain created conflicting expectations among Jews and Arabs. This ambiguity laid the foundation for mistrust that would later deepen into one of the most persistent conflicts in the modern Middle East.
Then in his place one will arise who will allow an oppressor to pass through the jewel of his kingdom. Yet within a few days he will be broken, though not in anger nor in battle.
Verse 20 describes the final king of the northern kingdom before the rise of the Antichrist in verse 21. In the prophecy's initial fulfillment, this referred to Seleucus IV Philopator, the Seleucid king who sought to extract tribute from the Jews in Judea by seizing the wealth of the Second Temple. The Hebrew verb nagas, used in this verse, can mean oppressor, but it can also be translated as exactor or collector of tribute. The King James Version renders this figure as a raiser of taxes, while the New American Standard Bible translates it as an oppressor. This person was Seleucus's chief minister Heliodorus, who not only attempted to plunder the temple but also assassinated the king after 12 years on the throne. Heliodorus briefly seized power as regent for the young heir, who was only 5 years old at the time. but he was soon overthrown by Seleucus's younger brother, Antiochus Epiphanes, the contemptible person foretold in verse 21. But in its latter-day fulfillment, this verse foretells a pivotal sequence of events for the Jewish people during and after the Second World War, under British rule in the Mandate of Palestine. Events that culminated in the rebirth of the State of Israel in May 1948. While the preceding verses relate to the First World War and its aftermath, verse 20 leaps ahead to the era of World War II and the reign of His Majesty King George VI. Until now, the prophecies kings of the North and South have symbolized empires rather than individual monarchs. But here, the focus begins to narrow, depicting not only the British Empire as a whole, but also specific rulers of the United Kingdom. Then, in His place one shall arise, refers to George VI, son of King George V, who reigned during the Great War. George VI inherited the throne after his elder brother, Edward VIII, abdicated in 1936 to marry the twice-divorced American socialite Wallis Simpson. Yet, behind the scenes, Edward's known sympathies for Hitler's Germany, which would later include allegations of treasonous collusion, played a far more likely role in the crisis of succession. Because Edward VIII abdicated before his coronation, the vision skips over his brief reign. Only the reign of George VI bears prophetic significance for the Jewish people, for it was under his authority that the land of Israel remained under British control for over 11 years prior to the Jewish state's rebirth. While Hollywood remembers George VI as the endearing, stammering king who found his voice in Britain's darkest hour, rallying the nation against Nazi aggression, the Jewish memory is far more conflicted. For during his reign, Britain increasingly tightened its restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine, even in the face of the Holocaust, and enforced policies that many viewed as oppressive and indifferent to the suffering of Europe's Jews.
During the reign of King George VI, and with his direct support, the British government effectively turned its back on the promises made to the Jewish people in the Balfour Declaration. In May 1939, just months before the outbreak of World War II, the British House of Commons passed the infamous White Paper, which stated, His Majesty's government believed that the framers of the mandate in which the Balfour Declaration was embodied could not have intended that Palestine should be converted into a Jewish state against the will of the Arab population of the country. It is not part of their policy that Palestine should become a Jewish state. The paper further claimed that the approximately 450,000 Jews who had immigrated to Palestine by that time had already fulfilled the intent of the declaration. It allowed only 75,000 more to enter over the next 5 years, after which all immigration would be contingent on Arab approval. These were the very years when Europe's Jews were in greatest peril, when Hitler's final solution was taking shape, and yet Britain, under George VI, closed the gates to their only available refuge. The king, through Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax, even urged Nazi Germany to stem the tide of Jewish immigration to Palestine. This policy was driven largely by Britain's desire to appease Arab leaders, particularly in response to rising violence in Palestine, much of which was fueled by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, a man who would later collaborate directly with the Nazis. The calculus was tragically simple. Arab oil and imperial interests outweighed the lives of Europe's Jews. And so, the chosen people were abandoned, sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical convenience, or perhaps more cynically, on the altar of the 20th century's golden calf, petroleum.
The oppressor mentioned in verse 20 is none other than Sir Harold MacMichael, the British High Commissioner in Palestine from 1938 to 1944, during the enforcement of the White Paper that severely restricted Jewish immigration just as 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust. Fascinatingly, the New American Standard Bible renders this land not just as the glorious land, but as the jewel of his kingdom. Within the British Empire, that term, jewel in the crown, was reserved for India, the empire's most prized dominion. Palestine, though not economically valuable, held immense strategic importance as a gateway to India. But in the eyes of the God of Israel, this land was not a colonial outpost. It was the true jewel in the crown, the inheritance of his people, and the future seat of his anointed king. And so when the British Empire turned against the Jewish people, denying them entry to their promised land, it sealed its own decline. In 1947, Britain lost India. In 1948, it lost Palestine. And during Queen Elizabeth's reign, the once mighty empire where the sun never set crumbled into a shadow of its former self. In 1957, after the Suez Crisis, Britain was forced to relinquish its claim as the world's leading power. That role passed to the United States, whose president, Harry Truman, had recognized the reborn state of Israel within minutes of its declaration. From that moment on, America would become Israel's foremost ally. Meanwhile, King George VI's government did not only oppose Jewish immigration, but covertly encouraged surrounding Arab states to go to war against Israel if it dared to declare its independence, as declassified Israeli sources have since revealed. The verse concludes, "Within a few days, meaning the years, he will be broken, yet not in anger, nor in battle." King George VI did not meet his end in war, despite Nazi Germany's efforts to assassinate him and install his more sympathetic brother on the throne. Nor was he overthrown in revolt. Instead, he died suddenly of a coronary thrombosis at the age of just 56. And soon after his death, the empire he once ruled began to vanish from the world stage, fulfilling also the prophecy of a king or kingdom broken not by war, but by divine judgment.
For over 1,300 years, the vision has marched unwavering through history, a prophecy unfolding not in vague shadows, but in concrete events. From the fall of Byzantium to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, from Heraklius to Napoleon, from the Arab caliphates to the British Mandate, each power rising and falling over the same sacred land. Daniel's vision traced every upheaval that shaped the destiny of the Middle East and the land of Israel during the long exile of the Jewish people. Each verse, like a step carved into time, marked a turning point, a war, a king, a decree, a betrayal. Empires came and went: Byzantine, Sassanid, Arab, Crusader, Mamluk, Ottoman, French, and finally the British, the greatest empire the world had ever known. And yet through all this, the land remained under foreign rule, until, at long last, in the ashes of war and the grief of genocide, a nation was reborn. In May of 1948, after nearly 2 millennia of dispersion, the Jewish people returned. The dry bones stood, and Israel lived again. And through those long centuries of exile, the people of Israel drank the bitterest cup. Scattered among the nations, they became a byword of scorn, reviled, hunted, and crushed beneath the boots of empires. They wandered from land to land, strangers even in the world their God had created, bearing the contempt of kings and mobs alike. And at the edge of modernity, their bones were laid bare in the death camps of Europe, withered into walking skeletons beneath smokestacks that reached toward a silent heaven. As the prophets had foretold, they were cast out because of their fathers' sins, but not forgotten. For the God of Israel does not abandon his covenant. He vowed that in the latter days he would gather a remnant, not because of their merit, but because of his undying love, and so the exiles returned. The scapegoat of the nations became a sign of resurrection. For what other people has endured such agony and lived? What other nation has risen from ashes, just as their Messiah, the man of sorrows, once rose from the grave? Yes, perhaps God allowed his people to suffer the fate of a scapegoat, that they might see their Messiah, who was pierced for their transgressions and crushed for their iniquities, reflected in their own pain. But as surely as the Messiah's humiliation gave way to glory, so too did Israel rise from disgrace to rebirth. The dry bones of Ezekiel's vision shook and stood. They walked not as spirits, but with sinews, flesh, and breath, marching homeward to Zion. And though the nations have risen against them these 77 years since, they have not prevailed. For he who watches over Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. Though the Prince of Persia may rise again, though Greece may yet scheme in the shadows, Israel stands, guarded by Michael, the great prince. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Yet I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill, and now that kingdom draws near. But before its dawn, there rises one more shadow, the last enemy, the one who exalts himself above all that is called God, the man of lawlessness. He shall enter the holy place and declare himself divine. The final seal of the book of truth remains unopened, but the hour is at hand. Perhaps, just perhaps, the time has come to open the final chapter of the book, to unveil the last king of Daniel's vision, the one to whom they did not give the honor of the kingdom. For it is written, "And in his place a despised person will stand, to whom the splendor of the kingdom has not been given, but he will come in a time of ease, and take hold of the kingdom by intrigue."
When we enter the climactic verse of Daniel's vision, it's important to pause and examine a subtle, yet theologically profound issue, a matter of translation that has far-reaching implications for how we understand the final figure described in this prophecy. In Daniel 11:21, the man who rises to power is described with the Hebrew word bazah. This word does not mean morally vile or wicked. Rather, it means despised, rejected, or held in low esteem. It describes how others perceive him, not necessarily what he is in himself. Unfortunately, many English Bible translations, including the King James Version and even the NASB, rendered this word as a vile person or a despicable man, which misleadingly shifts the focus from how this person is perceived to his intrinsic character. But consider this. The very same Hebrew word appears in Isaiah 53:3, a passage most Christians recognize as referring to the suffering Messiah. It says, "He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows." Now, can you imagine translating that as "he was a vile man and rejected by men"? That would be not just inaccurate, it would be blasphemous. And yet, that is essentially what happens in Daniel 11:21. If we don't pay attention to the Hebrew nuance. This is why the Legacy Standard Bible, LSB, which builds upon the precision of the New American Standard Bible, but goes even further in its fidelity to the original text, translates the phrase correctly: a despised person. This isn't just a technical improvement, it opens the door to a richer typological insight. Just as the true Messiah was despised and rejected, so too is the Antichrist, but the resemblance ends there. The Messiah was despised because he bore the sins of the world in humility, not for his faults, but because he defied worldly expectations. The Antichrist, however, is despised for a different reason. As Daniel 11:21 says, "To him the splendor of the kingdom has not been given." He is not seen as worthy of kingship, likely due to moral unworthiness, though the text leaves the reason unstated. Yet, despite being rejected, he will come in a time of ease and seize the kingdom through intrigue. Verses 36 and 24 explicitly states that he will be king of a hereditary monarchy. In this way, the proper translation not only preserves the integrity of the text, but it also helps us understand the true nature of this final enemy, not merely what he does, but how he appears and how he deceives. Now, as we connect the prophecy of verse 21 concerning the Antichrist to the context of the preceding verses, a coherent picture begins to emerge. The figure described here rises from a kingdom and a hereditary monarchy, one already introduced in the earlier verses. Importantly, Daniel 11:16 through 20 makes it clear that this monarchy must have ruled over the beautiful land, that is the land of Israel, before the rise of this final king. This mirrors the pattern seen in the case of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the historical prototype of the Antichrist, whose father, Antiochus the Great, had conquered Judea 25 years prior to his son's accession. The prophetic parallel is striking. If verses 6 through 20 align so precisely with the history of the British Empire, from George III to George VI, then the despised heir of verse 21 must also emerge from the United Kingdom's monarchy, a monarch whose predecessors ruled over the land of Israel during the British Mandate. Notably, Queen Elizabeth II's reign is omitted in the vision, much like the brief reign of Edward VIII. While her reign spanned over 70 years, she never once visited Israel, and her monarchy had little direct impact on Jewish history. This omission in the prophetic sequence suggests that her reign, though historically significant in other respects, was not theologically or prophetically pivotal, and so the identity of this despised one, who rises when the kingdom is at ease and seizes power through subtlety and intrigue, naturally points to the current monarch, King Charles III. The identifying marks of the prophecy also align most clearly with him. When Charles ascended the throne in September 2022, he became the longest-waiting heir apparent in British history. And though he inherited the crown through fully legal and hereditary means, he did so as an unpopular and despised crown prince, lacking the broad public support and admiration that had characterized his mother's reign. Although he was first in the line of succession and ascended to the throne by entirely legal means, his own people did not give him the honor of royalty, as the New King James Bible translates it, nor would they have wished to give him the majesty of kingship or splendor of the kingdom, as expressed in the NASB and LSB. And indeed, he rose to the throne in a time of peace. Though the war in Ukraine had already begun, the United Kingdom itself was not directly at war, fulfilling the prophetic detail that he would come in a time of tranquility. Finally, the prophecy says he will seize the kingdom by intrigue. While this may not be widely known to the public, numerous biographies of Charles, including those by seasoned royal correspondents, have noted his tendency toward secretive influence. He is said to have exercised power behind the scenes for decades, even resorting to deceit to secure his path to the throne and to position himself at the forefront of international power politics. These behaviors, often described by his biographers in Machiavellian terms, fit precisely with the kind of intrigue Daniel speaks of, a subtle seizing of power, not through overt conflict, but through calculated positioning.
It's one of those delicious quirks of history that Prince Charles was born in November 1948, exactly 6 months after the State of Israel declared independence from under his grandfather's imperial rule. At the tender age of 4, he watched his mother ascend the throne of a vanishing empire. In 1958, he was created Prince of Wales, a title reserved traditionally for the heir apparent, and he held it for an astonishing 64 years until he finally became King Charles III in 2022. That's the longest wait for a crown in the history of the British monarchy. If one believes in omens, and many do, the name Charles may not be the most fortunate of royal precedents. His two namesakes weren't exactly popular. Charles I was famously executed in 1649 after a civil war against his own people, and Charles II, though restored, was viewed with deep suspicion. The result, a constitutional monarchy designed precisely to prevent another king from acting like a divine right despot. And yet, with a hint of gallows humour, Charles III himself once remarked that he hoped to be remembered as vividly as Charles I. Well, be careful what you wish for. Surveys and opinion polls over the years repeatedly showed a lukewarm reception to his eventual kingship. Were it up to the British public, his son William might well have leapfrogged him. Even in Scotland, during his coronation in July 2023, protesters greeted him with yellow signs declaring, "Not my king." Still, contrast that with the Scottish tabloid Daily Record, which on the same week hailed him on its front page as King of the World and urged him to lead us through the climate crisis. And that's no exaggeration. For over 50 years, Charles has been at the vanguard of environmental advocacy, long before it was fashionable. Under his initiative, some of the world's largest corporations, representing more than 70% of global GDP, have aligned with his climate goals. He played a pivotal role in the 2015 Paris Agreement too. Despite the ceremonial neutrality required of his constitutional office, Charles has never shied away from supporting controversial figures like Greta Thunberg or protest movements like Extinction Rebellion. Some critics whisper, only half in jest, that he dreams of ruling like a benevolent 18th century autocrat who can impose global eco-policies for the planet's salvation. Then there's the religious angle. Charles has shown a curious affinity for Islam, sometimes more than for Christianity, despite being supreme governor of the Church of England. Palace insiders have noted his palpable discomfort toward American evangelical Christianity, and especially the so-called Jewish lobby, which he perceives as wielding disproportionate influence on US foreign policy. Certain fundamentalists, particularly among US dispensationalists, have even gone so far as to label him the Antichrist. Their reasoning? A cryptic calculation based on his former title, Prince Charles of Wales, which allegedly sums to 666 when transliterated into Hebrew and interpreted through the Book of Revelation. I wouldn't bet my pension on it, but such views do exist. Funnily enough, Charles I was also labelled the Antichrist in his time by the Fifth Monarchists, a Puritan sect who helped inspire the rise of modern democratic ideals. Now, Charles III is accused by some of undermining those same ideals. His 2020 endorsement of the Great Reset agenda stirred concern among liberty-minded circles across the West. All of which raises an uncomfortable question. Might there be more to these fringe theories than we'd care to admit, when even secular observers start to wonder if the gentlemanly facade conceals a tyrannical heart? You know the mood has shifted. Charles has expressed interest in being the first British monarch to visit Jerusalem. If he ever sets foot on the Temple Mount and assumes not only royal but divine honours, well, perhaps then even the dustiest Bibles might be reopened just to check how this story ends.
How does this story end? A question that has stirred the hearts of prophets, poets, and kings. Is the future etched in the stars or woven into the fragile parchment of a forgotten scroll? Are we drifting toward doom or being led step by step to salvation, toward heaven or hell? Perhaps the answer lies not in fate, but in choice. Not in prophecy alone, but in the hands of those who hear it. He points the way, but we choose the path. Every act of rebellion pulls us nearer to the edge. Every step in obedience draws us closer to the promised land, to the inheritance of those who choose the path of righteousness, who place their trust not in the strength of man, but in the hand of God. For is not all of history a witness to the downfall of those who turned away from the Lord and trusted in the arm of flesh? Ancient Egypt fell, Babylon crumbled, Persia vanished, Greece fractured, Rome burned. All these mighty empires, once rulers of the known world, now dust beneath our feet. They lifted their hands against God's chosen people, and they are no more. They crucified his Holy One, stripped bare his bride, and defiled his sanctuary. But the day will come when he will speak in his wrath and judge all who raise their hands against his inheritance. For the Lion of Judah shall return in glory as King of kings and Lord of lords. And then all nations shall mourn, and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And his kingdom shall endure forever, from generation to generation. And his kingship shall never be given to another,